Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about, we've talked a lot about other populations, about animal populations, etc. Today we're going to start talking about the human population. And all the way through this class, while we're talking about human population, please bear in mind that we need to be cognizant of the fact that increasing human population size and increasing human development, especially technological development, is placing an enormous strain on the biosphere. But bear that in mind as we go through. Now, my lecture today is going to be relatively short because I want you to pay really careful attention to the exercises that I have set, to doing your worksheets completely and properly, and especially paying attention to the lecture by Dr. Hans Rosling on human population. He says everything that I want you to know, but he says it's 100 times better than I can say it. Okay, and so please pay careful attention to that. All right, so let's start off our discussion about human population by having a think about where we actually come from. And I'm going to take you back to about between 2 million and 100,000 years ago. And this is the time span that this species of our genus is Homo, our species is Sapiens. And this is a very close relative of ours called Homo erectus. And Homo erectus is probably in one way at least, is the most successful of all of the members of our genus, ourselves included, because it lived for such a very long time. Not only that, it was able to spread from Africa, where the origins lay, and spread all the way through Europe, all the way over to the Far East, to Indonesia, and maybe even further. We don't quite know, but it may even have gone further. Very, very versatile and very skillful member of our species, but with a brain far smaller than ours. And one strange thing about them was that their brain development stopped quite early on in childhood. So from the age of 3, 4, their brain development was complete and didn't proceed any further. Nonetheless, they show many of the characteristics of human beings, of Homo sapiens. And especially the reason I want to mention them is that we can see in their culture and their behavior the roots of what would lead to the success of Homo sapiens. We see the roots of our cultural success in this group. They were able to use fire, for example. They were able to build shelters, but although the shelter was temporary. They were hunter-gatherers, and so they were nomadic, and they moved all over the place. They were very skilled stone tool manufacturers. They may have used clothes. We do not exactly know, but there are hints that they did, especially through the fact that they were successful in very cold climates. They dispersed very widely, as I've told you, over the globe. And they show some amazing cultural adaptations or cultural features. For example, that they cared for the elderly and they cared for the members of their group that were handicapped. There is evidence, for example, of cerebral palsied young being cared for well into their teens and into their 20s. And those babies with cerebral palsy would have been born handicapped. So they had an emotional regard for those babies and kept them and cared for them. They would have to be cared for by hand, carried everywhere, and yet they kept them until they died in their 20s, which was not a bad age, by the way. Most of the Homo erectus would have died in their late 20s, certainly by their mid-30s. They were not a long-lived species. So in terms of their numbers, we would estimate that they're probably no more than about 1 million worldwide at their peak. So our own species, Homo sapiens, arose also in Africa about 300,000 years ago. So we are a relatively young species, especially in geological terms, but especially compared to something like Homo erectus. And Homo sapiens, when it first evolved, lived alongside several of these other members of the genus, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, and some of them were close enough. For example, Homo neanderthalensis in Europe, we were close enough to them genetically that we could actually interbreed. And there is something which must set us apart from the other members of the genus, because the other members of the genus died out. Homo neanderthalensis was the last of our cousin species, if you want to think about it that way. It died out, and we as Homo sapiens survived. So all of them, Homo sapiens plus all his cousins, are all very skilled tool makers. But for the others, there seems to have been a limit to their innovative ability. They seem to have stuck pretty much with the same method of making tools for hundreds of thousands of years. And they inherited knowledge from ancestors, which they just perpetuated. They seldom improved on the knowledge that they inherited. But Homo sapiens appears to have been a great innovator. And this may be what gave Homo sapiens the edge over the other species. And we, for instance, made tools from many different materials, bone from wood, but also there appear very fine tools such as sewing needles, things like that, and tools which required really an innovative leap, such as spear throws. A spear thrower is something which enables you to throw a spear much further than if you just throw it by hand. And that would have taken quite some experimentation in order to produce. Lastly, the thing which really characterizes Homo sapiens, believe it or not, is our ability to make art, to think in the abstract and produce things which on their face have little practical value and yet have enormous cultural value. So that is very, very characteristic. All of these features of Homo sapiens allowed Homo sapiens to become increasingly successful and increasingly numerous. Now, they're still in the early years of the species, we're still hunter-gatherers, and they were still nomadic. But by about 50,000 years ago, it appears there were between about 1 and 3 million. The figures I'm giving you for the ancient times are very speculative, and you will see different numbers, but in that ballpark would probably be correct. But by about 12,000 years ago, something really remarkable happened in human society. And human beings began to abandon the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, although some groups still definitely maintain it and do to this day. But groups of humans began to gather together and pursue an entirely different lifestyle. And this we refer to as the agricultural revolution, because what they began to do was to settle down in one place, abandon the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They built relatively permanent shelter instead of building shelters which could be broken down and carried with them when they moved off somewhere else. They gathered together in a single place, and they began to clear natural vegetation and plant their own crops. And they began to select crops and improve and refine the crops that they grew. Now, they also, very importantly, began to domesticate wild animals, and they used those as a source of power because they used them, for instance, for plowing, but also for transport. And now they were not simply dependent on their feet, now they began to be able to do far more using the strength of the animals that they produced, as well as being able to use them as a reliable source of food. There were some downsides to this, however, that I will mention. And one of the important ones that we need to think about is that once people began to acquire land, once they established themselves on a plot of land, where would they go to do that? They would choose the best land to do it on. And other groups might not have such good land, and they might want to take over the good land. And to do so, they would have to come into conflict with the group. And we believe that this, in fact, laid the basis for much of the human conflict, of the human, I don't want to say instinct for conflict, but the cultural roots of interspecific competition between human groups was probably laid around this time. Up until that time, there was probably far less conflict between human groups. It was the acquisition of land, of property, and of things that led to this increased conflict. There were some other disadvantages that I will mention in a while as well. But overall, this was a fantastically successful cultural shift and enabled the start of a major increase in the human population side, only the start, as I'll point out. Now, we know pretty well whereabouts this occurred. And it was centered around this area here between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And it spread all the way from Palestine, all the way over close to Iran, to modern day Iran, in a great crescent, which we refer to as the Fertile Crescent, well watered at that time, well watered and with fertile soil, and with a relatively small human population when it began. They established towns and cities, which were a completely new invention for the human population, all the way through this entire Fertile Crescent here. From there, one thing that human beings are very good at in many respects is learning stuff, and is in exporting ideas to other human groups. This innovation of settling down farming, etc., spread very, very widely throughout the human population. Now, by about 4 to 5 million human beings existed by about 12,000 years ago. And this had increased at between 8 and 10 million by 10,000 years ago. It took a long time, in actual fact, for the human population to begin increasing. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one is the conflict. That the conflict led, in actual fact, to an increased mortality in the human population. Second of all, believe it or not, the hunter-gatherers were probably better fed. The reason for that is that they had a much wider variety of diet. They used many more things than they adapted as crops. So they, in fact, the hunter-gatherers, they were huge disadvantages because they had to root around for their food, etc., etc. Very dependent on the seasons, all the rest of it. They didn't store food or anything like that. But the early agriculturalists, they actually probably had a slightly worse diet than the hunter-gatherers. The other thing is that once they began to gather together in groups, in town, especially in these towns, well, of course, the towns were very small compared to what we used to today, but nonetheless, they were gatherings of human beings into a group. They began to be very susceptible to human diseases. And they began to be susceptible to epidemic. And this is especially the fact when they began trading between these groups. They began movement between these groups, and along with the goods that they were selling or the food that they were taking to be sold in markets, etc., they could also transport human illness. And these may be some of the reasons why the initial settlements, the initial development of agriculture did not at first lead to a major increase in the human population. There may well have been a compensating increase in mortality, especially infant mortality, as children became exposed to childhood diseases much more easily. So let's have a look. This is a classic graph of the increase of the human population increase since the foundation of during the agricultural revolution. So here, this is about 10,000 years BCE, and CE, by the way, stands for Common Era, and that is our era beginning about 2000, which began about 2,000 years ago. Time, by the way, more or less to the foundation of the Roman Empire. So the 10,000 years ago, BCE, there were around about 4 million, let's say. There may be some argument about that, but you'll have a look here and you'll see that the growth was very, very slow for all of the reasons that I've told you. And only around about 4,000 BCE did it begin to mark the increase. And if we have a look here, by the start of the Common Era, the world population was about 190 million. Now that is the size of not a small, but a reasonably sized country, maybe something like Nigeria, somewhere like that. 190 million compared to our current population of 8 billion is extremely small. Nonetheless, they were enjoying now successes of civilization. For instance, there were massive improvements in things like sanitation, even though we would consider them primitive. Still, nonetheless, they were improvements on what had been before, and technological improvements in communication, in transport, and all sorts of other things. And we now begin to see the roots here of the current increase in human population that we're observing. And you'll see that it is on a curve. It's clearly on a curve now. And this curve is a special kind of curve. It implies a relatively constant doubling rate of the population for a period of time running from more than 2,000 years. There is a doubling rate which is more or less constant. And by the way, if you're interested, this is referred to as a log or exponential curve. If we were to plot it on log paper, you know what that is, it would be a straight line from here on. So let's have a look now, not at the doubling of the population, but we're going to count it in billions. And here's a very important date, and that is 1800. In 1800, the human population was about 1 billion. So there it is there. And if we now trace, we're going to go to our next billion in 1928. So that was 128 years to acquire another billion from there. Now we're going to go to our next billion, and here it is here, 1960. That's 32 years. Now our next, 1974, 14 years. Now watch what happens. Now, 13 years to the next billion, 12 years to the next billion, 12 years to the next billion, 12 years to the next billion, and projected 13 to the next billion. We have here the increase of about a billion every 12, 13 years, and it stays constant for this part here, which is, of course, the portion of the graph that we are living through at the moment. So people looking at this graph would have an absolute fit thinking to the future, because we are already placing enormous strain. Here we are here, 8 billion. And we are already placing enormous strain on our planet, on its resources, and also causing problems, of course, with pollution and global climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And people are thinking, well, if we now carry on with this and we carry on increasing our population at this rate, there has to be a point at which the human population begins to come into direct conflict with the planet itself. And obviously, looking at this, we say to ourselves, we cannot carry on like this. On the face of it, it seems that not much is being done about this. But this course, this series of classes, of exercising classes, I hope, will show you that, in fact, something is being done about it. It's just that we don't necessarily know that it's being done. And I'll point to one thing. Have a look here, and you'll see that the next billion from, let's go, 8 billion, 9 billion, fine, 13 years. 9 billion to 10 billion, taking 22 years in the model. 10 billion to 11 billion is going to take even longer. What is happening? The curve, the rate of increase is falling. And that is something which should give us all good cheer, because it means that there are limits, inherent limits to this growth. It's not going to carry on forever. There is going to be a limit, and what we may have to do is adapt now, start adapting to the upper limit that we're going to see, because there doesn't seem to be much that we can do about it. So what are the things that in fact contribute to this population increase? What are the most important? It's very complicated statistically and mathematically. We are not going to talk about that at all. You will be pleased to know. But here are the things which are really important. The first thing is, how many people do we start off with? We start off with a relatively small number, the way we did 10,000 years ago. It's going to take a very long time to produce the kind of population that we're seeing today. Had we started with a much bigger number, it would have happened much sooner. So that's the first thing. How many do you start with? Second of all, that population is, the whole human population is divided. It's divided into one big group, which are those who are not yet reproducing, juveniles. Then there is a block, those who are reproducing. And the most important people in that grouping are the women, because they are the ones who give birth. Okay. Then there's another group of people who are not reproducing at all, the elderly, who are post-reproductive, being the most important contributors. So who's reproducing, and then within that group of women who are reproducing, how many births on average do those women have during their lifetime? That is a birth rate, a fertility rate. It tells us on average how many babies does an individual woman likely to produce in her lifetime. The more, the higher, then the higher the number of births, right? The lower that is, the lower number of births per lifetime, the lower the birth rate is going to be. Then the next thing that contributes, of course, unfortunately, you learn this, the story of biology is life and death. And all human beings are going to die eventually. But where and when they die is really important. When they die, when they enter that post-reproductive grouping and then die, they have little impact on overall population size. But infants die as well. And infant mortality is very important. And that is because those juveniles are going to age, and they are going to enter the reproductive grouping eventually. And if that juvenile cohort is reduced by infant mortality, the number that proceed to reproductive falls. And that can have a big impact on the rate at which a population increases. So in the world at the moment, currently there are about 4 to 5 births per second on the planet, which is quite extraordinary to think about. And there are about 2 deaths per second. And so we are gaining 2 to 3 infants per second. So this adds up to a net increase of about 1.13% of the population per year. And if we are to double the population, for example, if we were to go at that rate, we were to go from 8 billion, which we are at the moment, to 16 billion, it would take about 100 years for the population to double. It's not all that long. But that's not actually what is going to happen. That is not what is happening. It's not what's going to happen. And I will introduce you to the reasons why. So first of all, we need to think about what is it that would lead a woman or in a family to have a lot of babies? Having a child, giving birth, is an inherently extremely risky venture. And there is a substantial mortality associated with giving birth, and women know that very, very well. So what would lead a woman to actually strive to have several births in her lifetime? The very first thing is that poverty, especially, is associated with very high infant mortality. And children are extremely important, especially in poor households. Children are important. And quite apart from the emotional attachment that people have for their children, which is profound, they're a profound cultural asset. But apart from that, children are an economic asset. The first thing is that children participate in the economy of the family. They work the fields, or they work the shop, or they work whatever. They contribute economically. The second thing is that children care for their elders in the right kind of society. The children end up caring for their elders when they can no longer work. The elders, by the way, at that stage, contribute enormously culturally, because they are a source of knowledge to the rest of the society. So it's worthwhile taking care of them as long as possible. And the second thing is, in poor societies, there may be poor medical coverage. That adds to the infant mortality, but it also means that there's an absence of fertility control. There's very often in poor societies, they simply lack the ability to regulate the family size. And they tend to have very high infant mortalities, and they have lots of children so that they keep some children, so that at least some of the children mature to adulthood. So that now something happens now. And that is, many of these societies now move into a slightly improved situation in modern times. Technology does reach them, and healthcare does reach them, even if it's relatively primitive or whatever. But then this kind of mindset, lots of children, make sure that you've got some, so you have economic insurance, etc., etc. That mindset continues even when infant mortalities fall. Conditions improve in the infant mortality, and now people end up with lots of surviving children. And those surviving children are now going to eventually age into the reproductive cohorts, and they are going to, in turn, produce lots of children because they have the same cultural association. And this has been the source of much of this very, very rapid growth of the human population. We have improving medical conditions, but we carry over all of the cultural baggage from those times when we didn't. Now, if we have a look at societies where, in fact, the women have low fertility rates, they lower the number of births per woman in their lifetimes, what we see is that there's a very strong association with economic improvement, and especially with education of women and of girls. Once you begin to improve the economy of these societies sufficiently that women can leave their bondage to the to work to just maintain the family. Once girls can be offered a chance to move away from that kind of lifestyle and educate themselves, we begin to see that the birth rate begins to fall. Women will opt, given the opportunity, they will opt for fewer births in their lifetime. And so this is something that is a complex topic, and it's dealt with in some detail in the Hans Rosling lecture that I've asked you to follow. Okay, so here's something that's really important all the way through this. And that is we need to look, I've hinted already that we need to watch as these, we call them cohorts, as this non-reproductive juvenile cohort moves into the reproductive cohort, okay? So I've already hinted, but this may be important. And this is the reason why. Have a look here. I've just done it very, very simply. You'll see that it's actually done in a more complex way under normal circumstances. But here I've done 3 blocks: juveniles, reproductive, and then post-reproductive. This is smaller than this because this is a society that has a fairly high juvenile infant mortality. We're going to lose a lot of these in order during the course of people actually reproducing. So now this is a society left alone without any medical care or anything else. We might actually reach a point where there's so few juveniles that they just barely replace the reproductives. But this is a society which is improving, and it is improving especially in its healthcare of juveniles. And now what is going to happen is most of these, instead of now they are going to survive, and they are going to move eventually into this reproductive grouping here as they get older, and these reproductives will become post-reproductive. So here they go. Here's the blue. There it is there. There's the reproductive now. Here's the post-reproductive there. And they are going to eventually, of course, die off. But this is really important because we've now got a much bigger block of reproductive members than we had before. And they are going to produce, just as these did, produce lots of juveniles. Now they are going to produce lots of juveniles, and most of those juveniles are going to survive. And we're going to come back in another, however many years, 10, 15 years, and we're going to find that most of these have survived to move into this, and they are going to produce even more. And so on and so on and so on. And this is one of the things which has funded our growth rate over the last 200 years or so to a very large extent. Most of the babies are surviving and moving into the reproductive cohorts and themselves reproducing. So this is this is called a demographic curve or a population pyramid. And you're going to see it a number of times. But this is a typical demographic curve for a fast-growing population. And I'll show you real ones in a minute. So this is this triangular shape, typical for a fast-growing population. But what if we, to reduce the birth rate? Now, what if we get women to have far fewer births in a lifetime? Well, that is typical for developed nations with good medical care and where women have ready access to fertility control in all its manners. Okay, so here we have a different shaped population pyramid. Here we have a reproductive grouping, and they are barely, this may be slightly larger, sorry. Um, uh, we have to account there's still going to be infant mortality. Unfortunately, infant mortality is a given. It's just we try to keep it as low as possible. Here, the reproductive, they're barely producing enough juveniles to replace themselves. And here they go. Here come the juveniles and become reproductive. It's a small buck. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to barely replace themselves. Come back in another 15 years. It's going to be pretty much the same. This kind of curve is the population pyramid. It's typical of a stable population. And you'll realize that all you have to do is reduce the birth rate slightly here, and you'll actually see fewer juveniles than reproductives. And that is typical for a population which is actually shrinking. So we go out into the world and we'll have a look and see. And here we are. This is the population pyramid here for Nigeria, but it's typical for much of Africa. Africa is the fastest growing continent. It is by no means the largest population yet, but it is the fastest growing population in the world is in Africa. And this triangular pyramid is typical for many, many, many African countries. And you will see that here's our juveniles down at the bottom here. They are eventually going to move up here. We've improved infant mortalities, reduced infant mortalities, but the reproductives in many of these countries do not have ready access to fertility control. So what we're watching is these will move up into reproductive and themselves produce lots and lots and lots of babies, etc., etc. And what we're going to see in Africa is there's going to eventually be about a doubling of the population of Africa by about 2100. Here, on the other hand, look at this one here, and you'll see there are actually fewer, or pretty much the same, or fewer juveniles. We go to 15 years. Where are we? We go to 15 years for the juveniles there. And here's reproductive. Reproductive goes to 45. There's all our reproductives there. Here at the bottom are our juveniles. There are far fewer juveniles than there are reproductives. This is a developed nation which has had ready access to fertility control. And I would tell you that in addition, these are populations where women have access to education and to their own careers, etc., etc. And now the interest of women is not solely in the family, but she has her own career and everything, her own development to think about. And the number of babies which she's going to bear during her lifetime falls very often to one or at the most two in many of these countries. This is very typical. And this, in fact, is for Japan. And Japan has a problem with this demographic curve because their population is decreasing. That's the first thing. But second of all, they're not producing enough young people, and they have a very big post-reproductive grouping from middle-aged to elderly. And that is increasing because medical care is very, very good, but they are not replacing them at the bottom by juveniles. So this is a decreasing population. This is typical for Japan and also for Western Europe. And also, by the way, it is typical. We in the USA are approaching this very, very rapidly in terms of our reproductive capacities, as I'll show you in a while. Okay, so here's the current status of the world, where the populations actually are. And the bulk of the human population is over in India and China, 1.4 billion for China, 1.35. So this is about 3 billion in this whole region here, and another billion in this region here. Then we have about 1 billion in the whole of Africa at the moment. Another billion here in the Americas, both the Americas together. And then in Europe, barely a billion if you include the whole of, if you generously include everything here, barely a billion. So at the moment, as we look at it, it's India, China that have the biggest populations, but in actual fact, it is Africa that has the fastest growth rate. India and China have both reduced their fertility rates so much that they are barely at replacement. Each woman barely has 2 children to replace she and her husband in her lifetime. So with that in mind, we have to ask ourselves then why the populations here are still increasing. Okay, why? If they've reduced the birth rate so much, why are populations here still increasing? The same for here. Why are populations increasing when most women are only having 1 or 2 children per year? Well, I've given you the answer already. And that is, there is a hangover from the times when people were, fairly recently, when people were having lots more children, 3 or 4 children, because those juveniles are now entering the reproductive stage, and they are producing, even if they produce just 1 or 2 children in their lifetime, they are replacing themselves, and so they are maintaining the size of the juvenile population, so the population continues to increase until a point is reached. There will be a point reached where, in fact, we go into simple replacement of, but it's going to take some time before we reach that point. So here, have a look here, and you'll understand why this is important for the United States. Here you see these are birth rates. There's a number per woman, the total fertility rate. And we're going to, where am I? This is the 1800. Well, to have this here, ignore this. This is when the whole population was very low. And we're going to start considering here. Right? This is the fertility rate here. And look what has happened to the fertility rate. It plummeted and stayed really low. And the fertility rate in the United States is now below replacement level. Replacement level is 2 births per lifespan. We are way below. Our population is actually would actually be decreasing. This is very important. This is an important thing to remember when people start to talk to you about immigration, because our population in the United States is actually decreasing, and I'm sorry, our population in the United States is actually increasing only because of immigration. And that immigration is essential if you're thinking of success as being economic success, because we depend upon population increase to maintain our economies. And especially because much of the resident population becomes highly educated and no longer wants to do jobs at the bottom end of the spectrum. And so immigration is essential to the survival and the health of the United States. And the reason for that being that our birth rate has fallen. So let me just say something about this beginning part here. Kind of glossed over it and just went straight with it. Have a look where this is. This is 1940. So these are the war years. And this big bump in fertility rate here is the post-war, post-Second World War. This is when the soldiers came back. The families had a long time when the men were away. Women didn't give birth because their husbands and the men folk were away. Now they all came back, and they all tried for families, and here they go, very high. This bump here, this is the baby boom, of which I am a member. Okay, this is the baby boom here. High birth rates, high fertility right after the war. And then once we entered into period of economic development and the cultural shift, cultural change, the birth rate has dropped right down to where we see it here. Okay, so remember that cultural effects are very, very profound on fertility. And especially if people have control over their fertility, then they can respond to cultural change much more rapidly. The one thing I did want to also point out, that fall in fertility rate has applied also to teen births. Now, teen births here, this is the baby boom here, and you can see many people in those days did marry very young and have their children. But there has been tremendous concern. The teen birth rate has been very high, has been all the way since the 1960s, 1970s. And there are many reasons for that, a lot of them cultural. But there has been tremendous concern about this because many teen births become single parent households. And that is a tremendous struggle for the mothers. And correspondingly, it is a struggle for the children they're born as well. But teen birth rates have also plummeted in about the last 30 years. They are now really, really quite low, which again is a cultural thing. Teenagers are seeing that there's life after teenagehood and that they may have careers and everything that await them, and that having children is actually an impediment for many of them, and so they're opting not to have those children. By the way, I'm sorry, I've given you a link here. If you are interested, there is a link here. This is for interest's sake only. All right, so look globally, and yes, look what we've got. In a global scale, we are seeing a plummeting world total fertility rate from nearly 5 births per woman in her lifespan down now approaching replacement level at 2. And the reasons for that, you're going to hear a lot about when you watch the Hans Rosling lecture. You would see a lot about that. So now we have to reconsider what we saw before, right? When we saw these billion, we now have to look and say, how are we going to continue to produce billion after billion after billion? We aren't. The world population is probably going to start stabilizing. We still have to be aware of the fact that the population continues to increase while these juveniles move into the reproductive. But once that bubble has passed, these juveniles are going to start having far fewer babies. The birth rate is falling. And these juveniles, instead of simply replacing themselves, they're going to have even fewer. Many of them actually are now opting not to have children at all. And the birth rate falls like that, then your population, the rate of population increase slows down, and eventually you reach a point where it's at replacement level only, and then your population is stable. And that is what all of the models predict. The models all predict that we will eventually stabilize at 10.4 to 11 billion people on the planet, and that will remain pretty much stable. And this level here, this is what we have to plan for. And we have to plan very, very carefully. We have to plan for the impact that this 10 to 11 billion is going to have on the planet. We have to supply their needs, but at the same time, we have to do it without ravaging the planet. And so those are all considerations to bear in mind. Okay, so please do these exercises really carefully. Please pay attention to them. This is an important topic, but it's also a very interesting one. And I try to put together things which will excite your interest. Okay, thank you.